I'm black, you're white.
Now what? What if I say the wrong thing?
You probably will. Who doesn't? But I'll do my best to listen.
Maybe if we're humble enough to listen to each other.
Maybe if we're brave enough to lean into those difficult conversations.
We might.
We could.
Come up with some answers.
Make some real progress.
Discover how much we have in common.
And appreciate our differences.
Now you're talking.
I am Martyn Conley, a communication consultant.
And I'm Chris Thurber, clinical psychologist.
Welcome to I'm Black, You're White, Now What?
Today we're talking about the show, the series, this whole idea, and having difficult conversations, which is something that gets mentioned, but we actually want to give people examples, tools, and action steps to move forward. This is such a difficult time in our country right now, and such a huge opportunity. So, David, I feel like it's a blessing that we know each other.
Absolutely.
And that you came up with this idea.
I think it's, I think that's a wonderful thing to have people in your life that you can, have conversations with, where you can say, hey, listen, I want to learn about a different perspective and, increase my cultural IQ and have them perhaps learn from you. And I think a lot of times if we can do that and find some common ground, a lot of these issues might be at least closer to being resolved or at least understood. So I think this is a great, effort toward that. And so I appreciate you and, your all that you bring to it. So thank you very much.
Well, yeah, I'll tell you what's hard. And just to state the obvious, if folks are watching this as a webinar, if they're listening to it as a podcast, you discern from the introduction that I'm white and David is black, and now I've said it again. The hard part for me as a white person is to set up a conversation that's not with another white person. In other words, I can talk with my white friends about what they think about Black Lives Matter as a movement, and somehow it feels a little more stable or a little safer because I'm less worried about saying the wrong thing. But as long as I'm just talking about Black Lives Matter with my white friends and my white colleagues, I don't think I'm getting very far.
Right. I mean, some of the understanding, may be limited, in which case, and that viewpoint, considering or assuming that you all would have much the same viewpoint on that particular topic, it could make that, could narrow, the general understanding of everybody. Let me ask you, just while we're talking about why do you think that it's difficult for you to have that conversation with a black person?
Well, I think that the thing that I hear a lot of white people say is, well, Chris, sure, Black Lives Matter, but like all lives matter. So I'm not getting it. And I don't know if I say I support Black Lives Matter, then am I somehow saying that other lives don't, or doing a little bit of a disservice or something? And I guess the way that I've responded to my white friends who have expressed that concern is that I don't think Black Lives Matter has a subtext, other lives don't. But I do think that some people believe that or feel threatened by that. And it's sort of like why I would, in my writing, capitalize black. Like David is my black friend, Sam is my white friend, but I would have a lowercase w for white because I feel like black is, in my eyes as a white person, not just a color when we're referring to a group of people, but an identity. And I don't know that white people consider white to be their identity. So I'm sure that some do. I don't. So it's why I give it a lowercase w. But when I give it a lowercase w, I don't feel that I'm diminishing myself or saying that I matter less. But there's been such an awful history in this country of, beginning with slavery,
Mm-hmm.
this violent discrimination and subjugation of a whole group of people, that saying this group matters is exactly what needs to be said.
Mm-hmm.
So, I again, it's a conversation that probably makes a lot of white people uncomfortable, but extra uncomfortable if they were to have that conversation with a black colleague or friend. So, what's your take on Black Lives Matter and whether there is any subtext?
There's absolutely subtext, and some of it you touched on. I think the what's not understood oftentimes. Let me go back. I think there's a lot of different subtexts. Black Lives Matter is even being stated because historically, particularly when you're talking about police brutality and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
and the violent subjugation of the people, that has only happened and been okay uh, historically because either overtly or covertly, Black lives did not matter. At least not as much as white lives, and so you were sanctioned in treating black people a certain way because you had that thought in the back of your mind, because that was promoted, for the sake of slavery, then Jim Crow after, then, and even today, a lot of people will think, well, man, that's an era past because,
Yeah.
if no other reason, because we had President Obama in the White House, so it's all good. But for black people, it doesn't seem that way. We don't have that same reality. And so there is a need to say and let you know, hey, Black Lives Matter. And what's interesting is the fact that people say, white people tend to say, well, all lives matter, as if to say, well, it's obvious then that Black Lives Matter. It should be very obvious, but the reality for a lot of black people is that it's not as obvious as the rhetoric should suggest, would suggest.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what I'm living is not what you're saying. Do you know what I mean? And so, but the other thing is to not say that it matters more or it matters and other lives, particularly white lives, don't matter. Is to say, hey, our lives matter and we want the same equal treatment that's promised, with regard to the things set forth in this country by the founding fathers, etc., that we don't really, get and don't have. So there's that. But the other subtext, and this is something I'm kind of putting out there and asking you to think about too, as a white man, is that historically, when you talk about that subjugation of a group of people, white lives mattering has meant other people's lives did not. So I think when you hear Black Lives Matter, the fear is that, you're automatically saying, well, if this means this, then this means that. Meaning, if they're saying Black Lives Matter, what they're saying then is that white lives or other lives don't. So I got to make sure I say that all lives matter, so that we're clear that everybody's in to say, well, yeah, well, we've been saying all lives matter for generations, but
Yeah.
that, like I
Yeah.
said, has not been the history. So that's that's the other subtext in there, and I think a lot of times if people heard what's really being said, which is, I do not feel like my life matters when it comes to how I'm treated, and I would
Yeah.
like that to be better. I think then, if any rational person would then say, okay, well, that makes sense. But I think when you feel threatened in a way that says that your life may not be, or that I might be saying because mine does, yours does not, I think you need to kind of question why that's your knee-jerk reaction to that
Yeah.
statement. You know what I mean? And so it's like if you come to me and you say, "Well, David, I feel like I'm important." I think you are, and so that's fine. But my knee-jerk reaction shouldn't be, "Well, I'm important too."
Right.
So, for me to say that, I'd have to ask myself some questions about, why that's my knee jerk and oftentimes very spirited or violent response. Um, so I think in that way, that's where people who are saying Black Lives Matter are coming from. That's that I don't think being heard all the time because of some of that feeling, and some of that feeling I think is beyond consciousness. I think
Yeah.
since it's been, historically so ingrained in this country, it's difficult for people to be able to readily, consciously put their fingertips on it. I think it's a reaction that comes from all of that history.
Yeah. I mean, I think you explained it far better than I could to anybody. And I picked up on a way that you gave me a tool just then that I might use with some of my friends. I'm particularly thinking of white friends
Mhm.
when they do have a knee-jerk reaction like, okay, hang on, all lives matter, which is before I explain the historical backdrop, before I explain that historically for white lives to matter, black lives have had to not matter.
Mhm.
And we can put a very fine point on it and say, look at how much of the infrastructure and edifices that we have, including, lots of the monuments in Washington, D.C., were, right, built on the
Mhm.
backs of black slaves. But even before that, because I feel like it's one of the biggest difficulties in this conversation is
Mhm.
for me to try to explain something like that, whether it's to a white friend or anyone else, to be explaining it as a white person
Mhm.
doesn't feel sincere. I mean, and I liked what you asked, which was, why might this be your knee-jerk reaction? Um, and maybe there's even a way to ask that is somehow softer,
Mhm.
like, because I know people get defensive when you point out, oh, you're having a knee-jerk reaction. But if I were to ask one of my white friends who wants to insist, well, all lives matter, again, prior to my trying to paraphrase what I believe and what you explained, I might ask, well, tell me where you're coming from.
Mhm.
Say more about all lives matter.
Mhm.
And I think that a lot of people are going to come to their own conclusion,
Mhm.
as you pointed out a few minutes ago, that it does feel threatening if they're not taking into consideration at least two of the big factors you mentioned, that there is hundreds of years of historical subjugation, and it's not as if with the Emancipation Proclamation everything was rainbows and unicorns. Um, it's important to say that Black Lives Matter against that historical context. It's important to say that Black Lives Matter when there has been this implicit and explicit sort of working model of American society that,
Mhm.
well, white lives matter the most, and not that individual groups of white people have been immune from prejudice,
Right.
as waves of immigrants came to the United States, whether Italian or Irish or whatever, but all of that detracts from the what I hear you saying is the main point, which is you said, it hasn't always been okay to speak up and say, hey, we matter.
Hmm.
And I think if white people or any people saw the value of this movement, it's the opposite of a threat. It
Right.
strengthens the fabric of society when we can say, kind of, who's really gotten the raw end of this deal, and now let's elevate in some way the treatment, the status, the opportunity, and of course, as those words cross my lips, I worry that I'm sounding patronizing. So how does that come across to you?
I don't hear it as patronizing at all, and that's the thing that I would say um, to black people listening to someone who really wants to try, because a lot of things that I hear nowadays too is uh, when there is a white person who's saying, "Hey, I want to participate in the healing of the relationships between white people and black people, and I'm gonna start with my life and the people I know." Then I hear words thrown around like performative and that kind of thing.
Hmm.
Um, and I do think you have to be open to the change you're saying you want. And if you want people's hearts and minds to change, then you do have to be open to them making the attempt. And you have to understand that it's going to be rough, because without thinking for you, it's like losing weight, right? You gain weight like an ounce at a time or less, over time, eating that donut or that extra piece of pizza or whatever. And then you wake up one day and say, "This is terrible. I'm dying with all this weight on me. I need to get this off. I'm going to do it by tomorrow." It's just not
Yeah.
going to happen. It's about a habit change. It's about incremental um, betterment of your nutrition and exercise and what your whole situation. So in that way, it's the same with regard to your relationships, with regard to seeing people a certain way or whatever. You're talking about a bombardment of classism, racism, that kind of thing, that even the most benevolent people on all sides of it, they get affected by that. There's a certain level of tension and noise that just exists on a constant level, that the minute you start consciously, actively trying to come against it, you're going to fall back into old habits. It's going to be difficult. So you got to, as the person trying to do it, you got to understand that. But as the person who is witnessing it, who I am your friend and I'm black, I have to allow for some of that, just like I would hope that you would allow for some of that with me. I want to go back right quick to something you were saying that I think is interesting, because I hear um, a lot of friends that I have conversations with who are white, where they do talk about um, some of the ethnic bias they may have experienced, or historically their people may have experienced, when they say, "Well, um, the Irish or the Italians or what have you." What's interesting about that to me is that you can actually say in this country the Irish or the Italians or the what have you, but for black people, it's the black people. It's
Yeah.
not the people from Nigeria. It's not the people, like, I have no idea where I come from. And the fact that that whole thing has been,
It's hard to
I'm
talk about.
sorry, that's tough. And I didn't expect it to even hit me like this just now saying, but just verbalizing the fact that that whole thing has been just completely erased, and that I can't just go back
Yeah.
and touch that. So you can't even really say it's the same thing entirely. You know what I mean? It's like you have wiped that whole thing out. And so it's not the same. You know, it's not. And so I think when you start thinking about that, just the fact that you can still say, my people are from here and they have been this, and this is their history, and etc. And black people can't, says Black lives have not mattered in this country. So when you start then saying all lives matter, you think about a difference like that. Even your subjugation has been privileged. You know what I mean? I
Yes,
mean,
yeah,
and that's incredible that that escapes, you know, everybody. I'm saying black people, white people too. You just don't even think about it. That's how deep I'm saying, you know, that is. And so that's, but the impact of that on people is very, very serious. And another example of, even in modern day times, your life not mattering is when you say, okay, well, there's this police brutality and I think it's wrong. And a man says, I want to protest that so that I bring attention to it.
hmm,
And you completely rob the conversation of that and make the conversation about him being the enemy and less than patriotic without even dealing with what he's trying to talk about. You're saying that the lives that he's talking about don't matter. What matters is my idea of patriotism and what you should do. And for that, I'm going to punish you. I'm going to make sure you don't work. I'm going to, you know what I mean? That's
yes,
so. So when people say to me, well, you know, that sort of thing, the disenfranchisement, the subjugation of the people, all of that is over. Like, that is not my experience. I'm
yeah.
sorry. You know what I mean? And so it's just, it's very, very interesting and disturbing, you know.
And I think experience is what we learn the most from, and asking someone else what has been your experience
Right.
is, for all the reasons you said, a far better question than the more detailed question of uh, what are your thoughts about uh, police reform? What are your thoughts about the Black Lives Matter
Mm-hmm.
movement? Those are really important questions, but they, if they get brought up in a discussion, I don't
Mm-hmm.
know that it will be a fruitful discussion unless you've done a lot of foundational work having conversations with someone about what their lived experience has been. Uh, what have they been sheltered from? What have they been exposed to? And I was struck when I went to a conference in San Francisco
Mm-hmm.
that was about learning and the brain, mostly attended by professional educators. And one of the presenters during a whole morning 3-hour workshop spoke about trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that she said really stuck with me, and that's after 25 years practicing as a clinical psychologist. So, of course,
Mm-hmm.
I fancied myself pretty educated on something like the psychological effects of trauma. And she said, teachers get impatient with kids who are exhibiting symptoms that are the consequence of trauma
Mm-hmm.
because they pin it on effort. You know, this student just needs to try harder, or they just need to
Mm-hmm.
focus more. And she said, you're asking them to do something that for now is not as neurologically easy or even possible for them because of the brain changes that have occurred as a result of their traumatic experience, whatever that might be. And she said, you'd no sooner go up to somebody with a broken leg and say, run a 100-yard dash, and as they, limp down the track, you say, well, come on, faster. You got just
Try
got to put
harder.
one leg in front of the other. You got to pump your arms. You got, this is a sprint. I didn't ask you to hobble down the track. I said run. And it was really poignant. And I think we make a lot of assumptions. I can speak from my own experience. In that workshop and in lots of other places, have become much more aware of the assumptions you said at the beginning. Some of this is even unconscious. So people talk about implicit bias, which will be the subject of one of our future episodes in the series. But we're not even aware of what our own starting point is. So I feel that there's so much value in asking about somebody's lived experience, and I can come at an issue like police reform from a political vantage point, or I have a friend or relative who's a law enforcement officer, or here's why I think from a social construct point of view there needs to be some law and order. Okay, that is all interesting and very intellectual, but not very emotional. And until I take a look at what my experience has been like with law enforcement and ask other people what their experience has been like with law enforcement, I think we're dancing around it and we're going to talk past each other.
Absolutely, because you don't really know, what that person is how they actually see it, like you said before, through their experience, and their experience shapes, like, their viewpoint in any given situation, like, so seriously. And I think it's when we start doing this type of listening, like what we're talking about in these conversations, I think you do start to really understand the person, better, not just their thoughts, but like the whole, whole individual. And so and when you talk about trauma, the assumption is that the people, like, you say black people would be the only ones who have experienced trauma behind racism. And it's very difficult to wrap your mind around the fact that everybody has been traumatized. Like, people don't like to look at the villain in a way that says that they've also suffered some trauma through that. But you cannot traumatize people on that level for that long without it spilling over. I personally feel like that's impossible. A lot of times people will feel like they'll have less sympathy because of that. But I am saying, I'm trying to say it to say there's a lot for everybody to get over. And I think that when you are trying to bridge these divides and listen to each other, I think you need to start, and that I say you meaning anybody who's involving themselves in the conversation, need to start with the premise that if I'm feeling like I am somehow hurt or traumatized by this some kind of way, there's some trauma on the other side too, and I need to be aware of the fact that it exists, and I need to be to some degree open to it as well, and because as long as I feel like I'm the only one who needs to be listened to, then that means I shut down listening. Do you know what I mean? I'm the one who's been disenfranchised, for instance, so I don't have to listen to you. You listen. You make sure you listen to me, which I think is the bigger problem with communication most of the time. Anyway, everybody wants to be heard. Nobody wants to listen. So we just gotta, when we start having those conversations. That's why I say I think it's important to kind of go into it with an understanding that it's going to be difficult for more reasons than one. It's going to be difficult because you'll touch on some things that you didn't know impacted you like it impacted you, but you'll also, you know, likely have to open your mind to the fact that this person who you can't imagine would have any sort of trauma or have anything that they need to be listened to for might actually have something to say. Yeah.
Well, so you were really moved a few minutes ago when you were saying that the origin of your family is not something that you know about in the same way that somebody could say, I have Irish roots or Italian roots. And you don't have to talk about this more if you'd rather not, but I never heard you say that, and so something new that I've learned about how painful it is to have a part of your identity having been erased or removed or historically not important enough that it was documented or kept track of or something. I'm not even saying it the right way, but I'm wanting to know more about what that experience is like now for you, or talking to your kids about their cultural heritage, or how you even come to terms with that.
I mean, I think it's something that a lot of people just experience and deal with. They don't really try to come to terms with it per se. A lot of black people. There are a lot of black people that do, though. They attempt to, or they try to go back and do the Alex Haley and find out, where they came from. But I mean, it's extremely difficult because you want, and again, this goes to, all of the thing we were talking about with regard to how the many ways it's illustrated to you that Black lives don't matter, for instance. Okay, so I went to a historically black university. Shout out to Lincoln University in Missouri. Um, but one of my challenges at Lincoln was that when you go to Lincoln, and white people went to Lincoln as well as black people, they would say historically black institution, but there were, a large percentage of the population of the student body was white. But a lot of people graduated from there, so I don't want to make it sound like no white people did, but a lot of white people would go there and get most of their credits and then transfer those credits to a school like Mizzou and then get their diploma or degree rather from Mizzou, even though most of their credits came from Lincoln because Lincoln was more cost effective. But my problem was not that they attended the school. My problem was that if I go to Mizzou, I learn about how Europeans do things, which is fine because I'm in, a society where Europeans were the majority, at least the political or economic majority, however you want to look at it. But if I go to, say, what would be considered a Chinese school or Jewish school, I learned about how Jewish people do things, how Chinese people do things, the history of those people, etc. There is none of that. Or I shouldn't say none, I should say very little. If for no other reason, because there's a lot of what black people did in the U.S. There's a lot of, what you would know later as more contribution than you learned when you were in grade school, which is to say like 4 or 5 black people and that's it. They're the only black people who ever did anything in history. But with regard to the significance of Africa on this planet and things like that, you don't learn any of that, and that's all sort of washed away, belittled. And I'm not ragging on Lincoln so much. I'm just talking about a mindset. I'm saying
Sure, sure.
that there is really not many places, if any, that you can go to in this country where black people have an institution where they can learn about this country that they come from, not the whole continent of Africa, for instance. So we get the continent of Africa because we're just black people. We're not, I come from this country, I come from that country, you see.
Yeah.
And that makes you like drifting a little bit, like you don't have the cultural grounding that a lot of people have, so you're not even necessarily starting from the same place. And if you have that and take it for granted, as a lot of other ethnicities do, you will think, well, we're all starting from the same place, so that whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps things. But there's something about that makes it difficult, and difficult for you to navigate and negotiate, communicate as a people with other people without being consistently taken advantage of, and taken for granted. Your economic power exploited, that kind of thing. And so some of that answer would be for black people to realize that and to do something different with it. And that's not to say, shut down the American economic system and just only do, black stuff exclusively. And I'm not saying that entirely either. I am saying there should be some more strength in that. But I don't know how you would teach them that. You have millions of black people who have no idea where specifically they came from. Even if you did like a 23andMe kind of thing and they say, well, you came from this area, there's still not a thing where I come. Like I have some friends who are Irish, and they can tell you exactly where they still got people in Ireland, that they go visit and they can come. I don't know any black people that really have that. I'm not saying none exist. I know that there are some. I don't know them. And I certainly don't have that in my life, And so I'm just saying, I think that there's a significant impact of that on a people.
Yeah.
And I think that it's not enough to say then, hey, well, I never owned slaves myself, so blah, blah, blah. Oh, I've never been a slave myself, but the impact of that I'm still feeling. And Public Enemy, the rap group, used to have a line in the song where they still have the line, it's still in the song, but where they have a line in the song where
we're
they
dating
say,
ourselves, by the way.
Right, exactly. but where they say it wasn't you, but you pledged allegiance to the red, white, and blue suckers that stole the soul. Basically saying that you still like sort of, and I don't know what to tell you to do about it, but you still sort of benefit from this situation where I'm not, where that base for me is gone. I don't know. I mean, that's a difficult thing. I don't know what the answer is. I don't want to hold like you, Chris Thurber, as a white person accountable to say, well, you somehow need to, fix this for me. There's nothing that I know that you could do except to actually start trying to understand me as a man and as a person, as opposed to looking at me automatically as the problem. And I think a lot of times what comes with a lot of the things that I'm talking about is a sort of subconscious thing where the difference of me being black is looked at as deficient, off rip, I'm a filmmaker too, and screenwriter, and I won a contest a while ago at a film festival I went to, and it was one of the best run festivals I've been to, and I've been to some that were run very well and some that were just kind of, garbage. But this was one with regard to how organized it was, to the star power of the people who were there, the connections that could be made, where you actually could touch people, shake hands, and maybe really make deals. The stuff you hear about for like Sundance and Cannes, stuff like that. This one that I went to, I'm gonna name in a minute, but it was one of the best ones with regard to that I had ever been to.
Mm.
And so I was very proud to have won the award at this festival. It was the American Black Film Festival. But I would tell people I won the screenplay competition at the American Black, and the minute I say Black Film Festival, I could see the prestige of the award I won go
Oh,
down in their eyes.
yeah.
Like somehow it's a festival that's held at the supermarket now because it's, you
Right.
know what I mean? But it wasn't that. It was a major, major, and
Yeah.
it still is. I'm saying that festival still exists now, and it's a major deal. But I'm just saying that to say this immediately, and sadly, it's been programmed even a lot of times in the minds of black people too. It's not just white people, but just in general, when you say black, it comes down a few notches. That's the marketing of that
Mm.
racism. But some of that is based on the fact that you didn't think these people were significant enough or human at all, where their history, which was very important to them, should remain.
Yes.
Stripped it, you mixed them, you did, it's just black people,
Right.
just black, and so that's what I mean when I say so. From way back then on through now, how can you then tell me all lives matter and think I'm supposed to say, well, yeah, well, in that case, let me shut up. I'm not shutting up because I'm saying your all lives matter means mine doesn't. Your all lives matter means I don't have a base. Your all lives matter means I shouldn't protest when unarmed members of my community are being killed. You know what I mean? When you say that, it doesn't mean the same thing to me
Yes.
that it should mean like, I understand the words, but again, like you were saying, asking about my experience, you asked me if I understand academically the words. I do. I understand all lives matter. When you ask me my experience, it is not that. When the police pull up behind you, it's an inconvenience. When they pull up behind me, there is an actual, literal, real, whether I have warrants or not, fear for my life.
Yeah.
That's that's crazy. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? I'm saying my daughter was coming home from work one day, and she called us to say she was on her way home. The police had stopped her because she accidentally was driving without her lights on. When she's got me on the phone, my wife and I are we're getting dressed, getting ready to go up there because, and we're scared for her. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you're saying that to somebody who's never experienced that, it sounds irrational. But tell that to George Floyd's family. It's
Yeah.
not irrational. It's a very real thing. Now the guy was very nice. He let her know her lights were off, and she had actually she worked as a server, and she had actually had him as a customer, and he recognized her. You know what I mean? Hey, I was just eating dinner with my wife the other night. You were my server. Blah blah blah. And so it was cool. But I'm saying it's not always that. And the fact that was cool is fine, but it's still that fear is ingrained from years. I'm not saying that as a reformed criminal. I'm saying that as a law abiding, what I
Yeah.
mean, man all my life. And now, but that the possibility of that is present all the time. And so I'm just saying it's not my experience. So
Yeah. And it's not something that I can imagine,
hmm
or I can only imagine it. I can't feel it because it hasn't been my experience, as you said.
right.
And uh, so I'm really grateful that you shared all of what you shared, especially given how personal it is and how painful it is. And I want to, be respectful of everyone's time, and I see that we're nearing the end of this episode, and I
Mhm.
want to save time to give people a bit of a preview of other conversations that we're going to
Sure.
have. But I will tell our viewers and listeners that in preparation for this series, David and I decided that we wanted to make it unscripted. We wanted to make it personal. We wanted to embody the best we could the notion of leaning into difficult conversations and
Mhm.
show that it's raggedy, but you can persevere. And David, as you said, it is a good analogy, like losing weight requires persistent effort over a sustained period of time. And even though there may not be, as you said, okay, Chris, I'm not going to hold you personally responsible for this, so I don't have a precise answer to what is it that you can do in the next minute that's going to help. But David, you did mention some things that I think, again, I'll speak for myself, that I can do, and perhaps other people who are listening and watching can also do, which is begin by understanding the vast differences in people's lived experience. Begin by learning about parts of the history of the world that you don't know about. And not for people to misunderstand. Neither of us is asking for people to become, European history scholars or
Right.
African history scholars, but there are parts of history that, especially as it has been routinely taught in this country, give at best, as you described, a kind of tokenistic nod to, well, and then there was Martin Luther King. And so, okay, and
Mhm.
that's, the one, I'm embarrassed to say, the one black person that in high school, going to public high school in New England, in the mid 80s, that I learned about.
Mhm.
That's remarkable. And an awareness of how that contributes to what you said at the end um, of your most recent comment. That is, how does it contribute to my implicit bias, or maybe it's an explicit bias about
Mhm.
the relative importance
Right.
of you and me, of
Mhm.
can compared to the Black Film Festival,
Mhm.
uh, of Sundance to uh, the Black Film Festival, or something
Mhm.
like that. And it's a perfect example of why it's not enough for someone like me who's white to say, well, like, I'm not racist. I don't use the N word. I don't have slaves. I
Mhm.
don't see what the problem is.
Mhm.
Like,
Mhm.
so that's a really good place to start in this first episode, is a broad view of, um, and if we were going to give people uh, a couple of doable action items, I think one of them could be, think about your own education and your own experience and what it included and what it didn't include. And by
Right.
not including certain things, how did that leave you feeling
Right.
about the relative importance of those things, right? I remember taking, as an undergraduate, an art history class.
Mhm.
And recently, and we used Jansen, which at the time was the art history book. Uh, and my son asked me a couple of months ago about a piece of pop art, and uh, I don't even remember what it was, but I knew that there was a picture of it in Jansen, and we opened up the book and found the picture and got the date, and then we were thumbing through it because he was fascinated, because I had all these notes in the margins.
Mhm.
But then he became fascinated by what was covered and went all the way back to the beginning of the book, which has a chronological arc. And like a lot of art history books, there was a picture of this little statuette called the Venus of Willendorf, which is kind of this, it's a little stone statuette, often cited as, like maybe the oldest statue that's been found. I mean, it's relatively small, and it's kind of this fertility goddess, or we don't even know exactly. And clearly, I'm not an art historian, but Dacha sort of went back and forth and said, so where's the African art? Where's the Australian art? I was fortunate to spend 3 months in Australia, and we had some wonderful Aboriginal guides when we were in Northern Territory. We learned a lot about, in a relatively short period of time, Aboriginal culture and art. And there's not a single piece of Aboriginal art in this, which is not, and it's not called art like European art history. It's art history. The world. And so many parts of the world are left out. So a huge challenge to our listeners would be to ask themselves, spend some time thinking about what has been left out for you, and what then has that contributed to the way you see the world. Can you talk a little bit in the few minutes that we have left about some of the other topics that you and I was going to say are excited to cover? I mean, we are excited, but, as I think I said in the intro, nervous as well. What else are we going to tackle here? Because we're not shying away.
No, I mean, some of the other things, I think we're going to have a great discussion where we're going to drill down into some of the things that we even touched on in this episode. Some of the things about bridging the gap between inner city communities and the police. We're going to talk about defunding the police versus not. We have some law enforcement officers who are agreeing to come on and talk with us kind of about that. And we want to talk about the protests and, your constitutional right to do that. And we want to talk about perspectives as far as like understanding or, humor. A lot of times comedy is a way that we get to deal with some of these things, and what's too far in this day and age. We're going to talk, speaking about too far, we're going to talk a little bit about censorship and political correctness, and how much it helps or hurts. So I think a lot of great things coming up. We got young people's perspective. And so, like, people my son's age are dealing with a lot of things related to race on campus. And so we're going to be talking with them about their perspective regarding what's being done to sort of have a more inclusive environment on campus, and like we were talking about, what their experience is with the impact of some of those changes. Are they coming fast enough? Are they missing the mark, or are they actually addressing some of those issues? So, we're going to be talking about that. But also in all of these, we're going to be talking about how to have these conversations, and, what's a good way to open up, with people, and to learn from one another, and hopefully, enrich some lives and create some great dialogue and find some common ground.
It's going to be awesome. It's going to be great.
Excited.
And in case people missed it at the beginning, your wise counsel about having difficult conversations, especially with somebody whose background, ethnicity, race, maybe gender identity, sexuality, whatever it might be, is different from yours. If you're going to have one of those conversations, let them know that that's the premise. That you want to broach the conversation, that you want to improve in some way, or learn, or but not just to spring it on them. And
right. That's dangerous. But I think you do. I think you set some ground rules. I think you say, for instance, hey, Chris, I like to have this conversation, this type of conversation with you, just because I'm really trying to learn and understand a lot of things that have gone on recently. Have opened my eyes to the fact that my viewpoint on a lot of things may not be as broad as I'd like it to be, and I think you can help me with that. I want to make sure this conversation is candid. But I do want you to understand I'm not going to be, you can say whatever you want. I'm not going to be judgmental about what you're saying, because I really want to understand what you're saying and how deep the impact of what you have to say is, on you. And because I think that increases the understanding. It
Yes.
makes it
Yeah.
less academic. But also, I'm hoping that you'll do the same for me, where you will listen to what I'm saying without judgment, and maybe we can come to have a great understanding between each other and enrich our friendship, in doing so. So I think if you have that conversation and everybody agrees to that, and you might even approach the thing where you were saying earlier that you felt kind of patronizing if you would say certain things that you felt like that's how it sounded. I think I would hit that head on and say, listen, I do not mean to sound like that. I do understand that it can, but I'm not trying to do that. I'm really trying to understand. So, please help me. And then, have that conversation. And I think the other part of that is to not just do it in a way that's like, okay, I checked that off my list. I talked to my white friend. Whew, okay, I'm
Right.
good. So now I'm okay. Now I don't have to do that.
Yeah.
And whenever you get to talk to somebody
Difficult
about an issue,
conversation. Done.
right, exactly. When you get to talking to somebody, you say, no, listen, I got my certification. I've talked to my friend of
Right,
another
right.
race. It should be an ongoing thing. It should be a change of lifestyle for you, as far as like your desire to increase that cultural IQ and your emotional IQ too, as well. So,
Yeah. Well, I've taken a lot away from this first episode, and I am really looking forward to subsequent episodes. So thank you for your candor today.
yeah, and thank you. I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to our further conversations.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you for listening to I'm Black, You're White, Now What?
You can find more episodes on the podcast channel Teaching What It Takes, available on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify.
To learn more about the work I do, visit www.preparingthepath.com.
And to learn more about the work I do, visit drchristhurber.com.